So as Liz mentioned, my name is Elizabeth Jones Valderrama. I am the Executive Director of OAR, and I came here when I was 9 years old. I came to Buckingham Village, gates of Boston. Started my elementary school here in Barrett Elementary School. So definitely an Arlingtonian after I came from Costa Rica. And so I came in the 1980s, and at that time, there were about 700,000 people that were incarcerated in the United States. If you flash forward to today, in 2020, we have about 2.1 million or so people that are incarcerated in the United States. So clearly that it was a huge jump from the time that I arrived to now, and there's lots of reasons for that, and I'm going to tell you a couple. One of the reasons is in the 1970s and 80s and 90s, mental health institutions began to close because there was a lot of issues happening in those. And so that made a lot of sense. But unfortunately, there was really no other plan actually for folks to be able to get the assistance they needed. And so what ended up happening is that most of the folks ended up on the street and without the support that they needed. And unfortunately, that meant that a lot of the institutions that ended up housing these individuals were in actual jail and prisons. So for those of you who are in Arlington, in the Arlington facility, which I don't know if you're familiar where it is, but it's right at the courthouse where the AMC movie theater, across the way from that, that's also where the OAR office is. And so we're on the side of the brown building. And so for folks who end up there, the sheriff, Beth Arthur, has shared with me that about 30% of the people in her facility, in the Arlington facility, are folks who have been actually diagnosed with a mental health need. In addition to that, there's hundreds of others who have not actually been diagnosed. And we discovered that the most treatment for mental health needs in this country is happening in the jails and prisons. So the jails and prisons are the main top provider at this point of mental health services. And that really is not where I think, and many of you might think, mental health needs to be. So it needs to be there, but also folks need to be able to have other options, not just by being incarcerated. So that's one of the reasons why the population grew. Another reason was this idea of the war on drugs. And so most of us heard of it from President Nixon. And then it really has kind of stayed the course through all parties, including, President Bill Clinton, all the way up to where we are today. And so at some point, the aide for President Nixon was being interviewed to do a book, about a book that he had written. And one of the interviewees asked him, what is this war on drugs conversation? And one of the things he said was, well, let me really tell you what it is. It was a war not really on drugs. We needed to figure out a way to make it illegal to be Black or a hippie in the community. And there was really no way to do that. So we basically manufactured this idea that those communities were being, targeted and were being the most destructive within the segment of the population. And so the goal for Nixon's administration was to figure out a way to destabilize the communities of color and hippie communities. And so in that sense, that was one of the reasons why they decided to do this whole idea of war on drugs, which is when you go out, anybody who's ever been to the courtroom, even in Arlington or any in the Northern Virginia area, anyone who's ever been to Arlington County Detention Facility or any of this Northern Virginia area, the majority of people that you're going to see who are in those positions in courts, in probation, incarcerated, are mostly people of color, mostly Black or brown, and then really mostly Black men. So that is a fact. There is unfortunately no actual, a lot of people, you really can't debate that. I mean, that's really statistically factual. And so that, for a while, I think has been okay with the community, or the community has not had to talk about it or think about it. And that's kind of why it's fallen under the radar. So that's the two main reasons why this huge population shift occurred from the 1980s, 70s, all the way up to today. There are others, and we could talk a lot more, but the reality is that those are the two main ones. So in addition to that, I came here to the country. I was a person who did not speak English. And so, but you know, somehow when you're kids, you figure out a way to communicate with each other. So I ended up going to Barrett Elementary School, and that's where I met one of my closest friends, and his name is Tony. And so Tony didn't speak Spanish, but we made it work. And and he was really someone who helped me get acquainted with the community, with, you know, as a new immigrant, with the Arlington Public Schools. As a kid, I had a friend that I could always count on. He was always welcoming and kind to me. And so we went through the Arlington public school system. As mentioned by Liz, I graduated from WNL, and we both graduated. And I was very lucky to get a full scholarship for the first few years to go to UVA, to University of Virginia. And so Tony had decided that he actually was going to stay in the community in Arlington. And so he was renting an apartment with his mom. And, you know, even though it wasn't that long ago, you know, the reality of social media and cell phones and all those things were not as available as it was in college to many of the communities that we have today, of the youth that we have today. And so, you know, like it often happened when we were childhood friends, we lost contact with each other. He had moved from the apartment where he was been living with his mom. And so I just couldn't find him. So years kind of went by, and I still, you know, every time I came home and I tried to find him, etc., but couldn't really. And so in the end, I ended up just kind of moving along in life and hoping that he had done the same. So after I came back from UVA, I started working at another Arlington Public Schools. I was working at Patrick Henry Elementary School. So for many years, my dream was to be a teacher, to be an educator of some sort. And so I ended up going in to be administrative support to the principal at Patrick Henry Elementary School. And so that allowed me to be kind of at the front of the school, in the front office, so parents and kids would come in to see us. And so one of the things that occurred is that Patrick Henry, for those of you who aren't familiar, it's no longer there, but for those of you who aren't familiar with it, the location back then, it was close to the Cinema Draft House by the Columbia Pike Library. So it's that Walter Reed kind of Columbia Pike intersection. And so that is South Arlington considered. And 85% of the kids who were at Patrick Henry were actually on free and reduced lunch. So that's kind of just to give you an idea of the population. Mm-hmm. And so as I was in there for about 5 years, one of the things, or 3 years, excuse me, one of the things that occurred was that I started seeing some youth, some kids, again, this is elementary school, pre-K to 5th grade, some kids that were coming over with guardians. And so I started asking a little more questions about the guardianship and all those things. And many of them shared with me that it was because their parent, their father, mother, etc., was incarcerated. And so that they had gotten guardianship at this time. So that was an interesting realization for me, because most of the folks that were coming through were coming in from, you know, were people of color. And so that's when I really started looking at what happens in the United States with incarceration. And so I did a quick Google search and realized that OAR existed right in my backyard. And so OAR, as you heard, was founded in the 1974s. It came from a movement in the 1960s that originally started down kind of in Southern Virginia because there was a riot in one of the prisons down there. And so the community decided that what folks needed that were incarcerated was to receive mentoring and support and visits. And so they started establishing this movement. And so OAR has always been called Offender Aid and Restoration. We usually just use OAR because some of that language is no longer valid in our view, and we can talk about that in a minute. But that is what it has always stood for. At the heyday of OAR in the 1960s and 70s, there were about 20 OARs up and down the kind of East Coast of the United States. Now there are 6 of us left. So there is us, which is OAR Arlington, serving Arlington, Alexander Falls Church. There's OAR Fairfax. They serve Loudoun, Fairfax, Prince William, those kinds of areas. There's Richmond, OAR Charlottesville, OAR New Jersey, and OAR Newark. Oh, no, sorry, New Jersey, OAR Indiana, excuse me. So OAR Indiana. So there's 6 of us left. So at this point, Many of us are left because of the connections we've been able to build with the community, because of the financial support from counties or cities that we're connected in. The other ones who unfortunately were not able to continue the establishment was because they were not able to establish funding for enough time. And so I came to OAR, and that was in 2005. So when I came to OAR, I learned a lot. I was thrilled to be here in this community. And one of the things that I got to do in my role was to go out and to speak to the folks who were incarcerated, to talk about the opportunities that we had at OAR and that were waiting for them either while they were there, with their connection with their families, or post-release. And so as I was there, I got to go speak to lots of different communities of incarcerated individuals. And so we had folks in Arlington Jail as one of our sites that we go to on a daily basis. Alexander Detention Facility we go to again on a daily basis. And then on a weekly basis, we go out to Coffeewood Correctional Center. Coffeewood is actually out in Culpeper, Virginia. Culpeper, Virginia, you know, is about an hour and a half to 2 hours from here. And the reason why that is an important site for us is because that is the closest prison setting to the Northern Virginia area where people are actually, who have been sentenced, are coming home here. And so we want to make sure we get to connect with them so that we can be sure that they have a welcome community when they call. Culpeper, I gave my spiel about the work that we do, and then I finished. So when I started kind of packing up my things, and then I heard my name called, I looked up, and it was my friend Tony. So certainly years have passed. We were definitely both older than we were when we were kids, but he still had the same kind eyes and appeared to me a spirit and smile that had welcomed me when I was a child. And that had been my friend for many years. And the only other difference, though, was that I got to go home that day and Tony was incarcerated in a uniform. And so that trip back from Culpeper really affected me. It obviously impacted me, and it allowed me to remember that good people, our loved ones, are sometimes in these situations for lots and lots of reasons. And I believe that they deserve to come back home to the community, and that we should be here to welcome them and support them to thrive when they come back home. And so that's another reason why I continue to stay with OAR for many years. I then came back home and started even working harder. And in 2016 or so, so that was in 2010 and 2016, I came into the office and there was my friend Tony sitting at the front area waiting to see one of our team members. And I was thrilled. He actually had told me I had been out for a couple of months and our team had already been helping him with assistance on finding a room to stay, had been able to get him a job. And he was starting to have the conversation with his mom again to try to establish a relationship. And so that was amazing. And 2 years later, in 2017, he continued coming. I went to the parking lot outside of OAR to put money in the meter, and I hear this little beep. I look, and I see there's my friend again. At that point, he was getting off probation. He had been able to rent a room, kind of a studio for his own, and he had been able to keep the same job that OAR had helped him get, and had bought this little car. And so he was thrilled, and I was so happy to see him. And so that is the magic or the miracle or the mission of this amazing organization. And that's why I've been there for 15 years. Now, I'm not the only one that's been there for years. I also have another team member, Katie Steinbrook, who is our deputy director. She's been there for 20 years. Steinbrook might be a name that's familiar to you all because she's the daughter of John and Erna Steinbrook, who established N Street Village in DC. So for those of you who are familiar with that community, that is them, and Katie has been before the womb already doing all the work that we're doing, so I'm thrilled that she's on our team. So that's kind of what's been my story with OAR, and on a given year we work with about 2,000 people or so, between 2,000 and 2,500 depending on what's going on in the community. And we have 3 areas of our work. I know that previously we shared the video or the conversation around upstream and downstream work, but just to give you a quick kind of reminder of what that is. So let's say you're out in the community walking, you come back to a stream. All of a sudden you're alone there and you see a baby coming down the stream. So you look around, there's nobody there. And so what you do is you obviously rush in to help the baby. So you get the baby, and then you look around and, uh-oh, here comes another baby downstream. So you start calling all your friends and you say, hey, find some housing for this baby, find some education for this baby, find some clothing, find some food, find some whatever. And all of those things happened. And so all of a sudden then we get really good at pulling babies out of the stream and getting them somewhere in the nonprofit sector, right? But at some point, somebody has to be like, well, what's happening upstream that all these babies are falling in? It's not like it's their natural habitat to be down the stream. And so that's the idea of what OAR for years has been doing amazing downstream work with our direct service and community service and reentry. But at some point, again, we needed to get up here at the upstream level to figure out why are so many people falling. And some are clearly being pushed. And so we discovered that it was really important for us not just to do this great downstream work, but critical for us to do upstream work. And at some point, what I'm hoping the community will do and our fellow nonprofits will do as well is OAR is going to be 50 years old in 2024. And 50 years after that, if the community and all of us do amazing work up here in the upstream, then we won't need to have an OAR 50 years later. We won't need to have all of these other programs because we are going to figure out what the root cause is. So, hey, you're like, that's an easy thing. Let's make that work. So let me tell you what the root cause is. It's racism. The root cause of people falling and needing support downstream is racism. We did several years of studying that, and we are clearly in the criminal legal system, one of the easiest ways that can be connected to race, one of the easiest ways, because as I mentioned, there's just so many people of color connected to this, disproportionately connected to this. So OAR decided, okay, we're gonna figure out how to be upstream. And so our upstream work has been both within our organization, looking at our kind of racism and colonizing ways at OAR. And so we are now working on becoming an anti-racist nonprofit, a nonprofit that is pro-Black, because the opposite of racism in this country is really anti-Blackness is very close to racism in this country. So the opposite of anti-Blackness and racism is pro-Blackness and anti-racism. And so OAR needs to be on that journey to make sure that that's where kind of we're leading. And so in addition to internally at OAR, we have also connected and tried to connect with the community to support them on being on the journey as well of becoming anti-racist and racial just. And so we offer anti-racist and racial just cohorts where people can come in and spend 3 hours a week with us for 10 weeks. It's a 3-month program, and they can learn how to be anti-racist and racial just individuals. And this isn't just, I'm gonna go to a 2-hour thing, or I'm gonna go to a 1-day training and check off the box. This is a really having to do work kind of component. And so we do offer that out to the community. Our first group are starting in September. So our first cohorts, we're going to have 3 total cohorts. One of the cohorts is going to be for BIPOC, so that's Black, Indigenous, and people of color. And then the other 2 cohorts are going to be for white people. And because again, for us, the learnings for BIPOC and white people are very different from each other. People of color or BIPOC have to learn about our internalized inferiority and our conditioning in this community. And white people need to learn about their internalized superiority and their conditioning in the community. So they're 2 very different learnings. And it will allow us also, because we're separated, to reduce harm as much as we possibly can. So we aren't harming each other when we're having really those authentic conversations. So that's one way. Particularly what we do is we really try to focus on those who come very close in contact to the work of OAR, the participants at OAR, which is law enforcement, courts, anybody in the criminal legal system. So we're always out recruiting for sponsors so that we can support those folks in law enforcement in the criminal legal system to come to this cohort for free, so that they don't have a situation where people are saying, I can't make it because I don't have income in our in our police force or et cetera for training. So we don't want that to be an excuse at all. So that's our upstream work. Then our downstream work is twofold. One, we know incarceration is incredibly traumatic. No matter how rehabilitated you want it to be, it's incredibly traumatic. And so we created this idea of alternative sentencing. OAR was found on the idea of restoring wholeness to the community and alternative sentencing. And so the idea is that when someone harms the community, that we all have to come together, the person who has been harmed, the community, and the person who has caused the harm, and all of our supporters around, to create the community again, to build the community again, to be whole again. And so we have established something called an alternative sentencing component of our work, which is our community service. So community service work both with youth and adults of all genders. We do community service for the City of Falls Church and the Arlington County Courts. And what you do there with community service is that it allows the judge or the Commonwealth or attorneys or whatever to sentence someone to actually do volunteer hours in lieu of incarceration. So you can imagine how much better that is for the community than sending someone away. So yes, and so we have that kind of component of our work so that people can stay home with their families, can go to school, can keep their job, don't destabilize as much, rather than going into incarceration doing volunteer service. Another way you can get volunteer service for community service is, many people don't know, but when folks are incarcerated and go through the courts, etc., even if you are someone who doesn't have enough income and you are getting a public defender, people have to pay for that. And so you come out of incarceration with a lot of debt for the courts and a restitution and all those kinds of things. And so if you don't have the income to be able to do all those things, you go ahead, and one of the options is you can ask the court to be able to sentence you to complete community service so that those community service hours can count towards your returning money into the court system. So again, that's huge for people who are trying to do everything they can, pay bills and work and all of that. And then our last component of our direct service work, downstream model, is reentry. So we believe reentry begins at the moment that you are first entering the detention facility and goes all the way up to 18 months after you have been released. So we are more of an emergency reentry component. There are reentry programs that go after 18 months of release, and those are ones we connect people with, but we really focus on kind of the immediate emergency reentry. So inside the facilities, we go in, we do presentations. We have, right now, because of the pandemic, we have virtual classes that we do. So we do all of our classes through cameras and videos and laptops. We do all of our kind of intakes and case management through that component as well. We support families while people are incarcerated. You know, you've lost an income, you have no money for school supplies, for holiday gifts, for food. So all of those pieces are critical. In addition to that, when people come back out, we support them in welcoming home. They have welcome backpack kits, and those kits include different kinds of supplies. So brand new backpack, brand new clothing in their size, brand new shoes in their size, transportation, a smartphone with minutes and data on it, assistance to get to wherever they're getting to, food, etc. So lots of things that anybody could think of would be helpful when people are coming home. And also then additional case management and support and really coaching as people are coming home once they're here. We do employment, we do life skills, we do anger management, stress management, all of the things that you can possibly imagine, housing placement, you know, connection with mentoring and volunteering programs, connecting with their family, sending gifts on behalf of the people who are incarcerated to their children, all of those things that are required for folks to come home. And so I can certainly go into much greater detail about the work that we do, but I do want to come back to a couple of questions that I've gotten from folks in terms of this work. And so I just want to kind of make sure I'm covering those as well. So we have tours that we do on every twice a month or so, or once a month at least, and that's on our website. We also have these cohorts that I mentioned, and so cohorts, we really want anybody in the community to come. So I'm going to follow up with links. We also do an ethical storytelling component of our work. So what that means is that we don't actually prop up participants to go and tell their own story in this community. It is very traumatizing to relive that. It can be triggering. And so we get their story, we pay for their story so that they know that their story is valuable. And we have storytellers that actually tell the stories, though it is not them standing there in front of hundreds of people to tell their story. And so, you know, that is critical for a community as is close knit as Arlington, because everybody sees each other. And so you don't want people knowing exactly somebody's life story because you came to an OAR event and heard it. That's not really what you want to do. And you want to get to know that person just on their own. Another thing that we have is we clearly have an e-newsletter that goes every month, and I can send you links on how to register for that. We have a mobile action network, which is a texting component where we ask people to kind of mobilize. We have an anti-racist kind of action component network where we have specific goals that people of color, that the voices of people of color have said are needed in the community, and we ask everybody to kind of get behind them. They're like 25 action pieces that we like, and so we have kind of an action network there. I think it's also important for people to understand that even with all of this amazing work that we're doing from a direct service perspective, one of the things we have learned is that people obviously come home and there's a ton of collateral consequences behind that. So imagine if you've ever had an experience with having trouble getting jobs, getting your resumes in, getting apartments, connecting again with the school, all of those things are collateral consequences for our people. And so what happens is if you have some sort of felony or some sort of misdemeanor record on your record, an employer can say, you know what, I'm good, especially in a community that's so highly educated like Arlington is. You know, most of us here have a bachelor's, if not a master's degree, and you have someone coming out who has a GED and they're wanting to apply for jobs. And in addition to that, they have a record. And so you really are getting a lot of collateral consequences and barriers for people to come back home and thrive. Say for housing. Housing is a way to discriminate basically people of color, particularly because at this point, the majority of the people that are incarcerated are people of color. So I think that is a really critical piece for us to advocate as well. So there's lots of barriers. All right, so I'm seeing some questions in the chat. So I do want to now open up to questions. Yeah, absolutely. And so I think part of what we try to do with the cohorts is that we do look at our items internally, right? So the first area of transformation that's needed is an internal transformation. So transformation starts here with you as an individual. And then when you transform yourself, you then can also connect. One of the things we learned through COVID, through the COVID-19 pandemic, is that most of the communities who are being affected are unfortunately people of color. But in addition to that, we've learned that we know about 2,000 people in our sphere. So you as an individual talking about racism and really trying to support individuals, et cetera, within this community by talking to your group of 2,000 people makes a big difference because they also know 2,000 people and they can also then support other people in learning. So certainly ourselves, but then others, right? And so how do you do those kinds of things? We have lots of readings that we recommend. You know, one of the recommendations is So You Want to Talk About Race. I know that we sent out an email with a few options. So that book really is an empowering book. It's written by a woman of color. And as a person of color, what I really loved about that book is that it really described a lot of my experiences. So we often get white people who say, well, I want to get friends with people of color. I want to hear people of color's experience, right? And so I appreciate that. And I know you want to learn and hear from that. And I think one best way to do that is for you to read some books and to watch some videos and to do some Googling. And so certainly, So You Want to Talk About Race is a good book. The other book that's really good is White Fragility. Another book that's really good is How to Be an Anti-Racist. Another book that's good is Eloquent Rage. I mean, we have so many options. We also have, you know, videos that we can also, I think required reading should be, you know, When They See Us, which is about the exonerated five of New York, Central Park. I think another one should be the 13th, because that's the 13th Amendment, and that's a huge documentary that would be really important. So I think the reality is that folks, there's a lot and lots of materials you can read, but I also want to recommend that you just read normal books, right? You just read books where people of color are heroes, where people of color are mothers and fathers, where people of color are flawed, just like all of us, but also when people of color are doing amazing things, they have fallen in love, etc. You know, I was in a book event last night, and through a virtual book event, and one of the speakers said, "I know we all say Black Lives Matter. They should also matter in your bookshelves. You should also be buying books from authors of color and having your kids and your grandkids and your loved ones reading those books too, so that they can see and they can understand that Black people have lives, or people of color have Black lives, but have lives just like all of us." Same from TV shows. Adopt 2 or 3 TV shows of people of color. Blackish, Queen Sugar. I mean, there's so many options out there. So adopt some of those shows and watch them fully and really try to understand. Because I think one of the pieces that's important is that for those of you who really want to have relationships with people of color, have them with these folks on TV and with these books and with these authors, etc., so that you aren't actually then potentially traumatizing the rest of us with some of the interactions, right? So one of the things I often like to say is, you have to build deep relationships with people before you can start asking them questions about their background, their life. Just like how I wouldn't just go out and ask you some sensitive questions that I've never met you. Same thing for people of color. And I know you want to learn, and I appreciate that. And I know it's coming from love, and I appreciate that. And so if you could start out with all these before you begin your relationships with people of color, that would really be ideal. For that question. So the idea, how many of you by raise of hands know this idea of school to prison pipeline? Just looking around. Okay, cool, awesome. All right, so we have several people who understand this idea of school to prison pipeline. So school to prison pipeline means that when our kids, so let me start by saying that every single system in this country is failing people of color. Every single system in this country is failing people of color. Schools, banking, medical health, medical and health, obviously, housing, employment, I mean, just name it. All of those are failing people of color. And so schools is the primary one that's failing people of color. So when our kids, our children of color go into educational settings, most of the people who are facilitating or teaching to them are not people of color, who don't come necessarily from the background of the kids. So they don't actually they have very limited connection to the experience and lives of the children. And so we are having them read certain things. We are assuming that they're meaning something by their actions, their vocals, their movements, when that is not actually the case. And so there's studies out there that talk about, you know, kids start to understand race as good or bad as early as 2 or 3 years old. And so we really, as facilitators, need to be very careful with how we elevate people's voices throughout. And so, yeah, so the research shows that boys and girls who are Black particularly, but of color overall, are ones who get moved into detention, or seeing the principal, or seeing the police officer that's in the school much more. When we have metal detectors in the school, we also are already institutionalizing kids to go through those things. That's another piece. When you have, you know, the different locker searches and all those kinds of things, looking for certain things. But just in general, one of the biggest things is suspensions and detentions. And you all can, you know, Google this as a factual thing. But the reality is that people of color get suspended and detained, get detention and suspension a lot more than any other kind of than white people. And so, and that's part because the teacher is seeing their feedback to something they're saying as disrespectful, as you're not paying attention, you're not listening. But when we have that from a white child, it's like they just need more creative outlets, right? They just need to go to gifted programs. No, it's the same concept, right? And so again, within your classes, for those of us who are teachers, for those of us who went to school, all of us went to school, how many books by Black authors did you all read in 1980, 70, in 2009? How many? There was really very little. What, a mockingbird, To Kill a Mockingbird, which is super racist. I mean, like, so again, let's look at what we have been reading and what's in our bookshelves and what our teachers are, and let's ask them to do that. In addition to that, history books are completely flawed, everybody. Newsflash, it's completely flawed, right? All of a sudden we figure out, like, we talk about slavery like it was a weekend project, and then everything got better, right? And so, no, that's not what happened. Let's read 1619. Let's read all of those things, and let's rewrite those history books, because we're going to keep being ignorant about this information unless we really figure those out. Most of us didn't learn about anything around African American or world history until we got to college, and even those books aren't actually diverse in education. And yes. So I think there's a lot. One of the things that I think is really important for us to understand is that, yes, voting, protesting, all those things are really critical. Changing laws are really critical. And at the same time, most harm comes from horizontal relationships. So most harm comes from you to your person of color friend. More harm comes from you to your employee. More harm comes for you colleagues with each other. Most harm for us, and most most blockage and barriers comes from horizontal relationships. And so that means that, yes, go out and march, yes, go out and chant, just go out and do all those things, and at the same time hire more people of color. At the same time, make sure the person of color in your life is cared for, respected. Check on them, smile, say hello to them. We often get people who are coming home from incarceration who say to me, I walk past people and nobody looks at me in the eye. White people just look the other way or look down. People are waiting to be acknowledged, to say hello to them, to say, hey, welcome, you're valued. And so I think there's very simple things like talk to your uncle Bob, or whoever else it is. I said Bob, but there might be some Bobs are totally fine. Talk to whoever your uncle is at the dinner table that makes people uncomfortable, right? And so let's shift that narrative from Bob is uncle is the person who needs to be uncomfortable, right? Not the rest of the table. Why do we have to be uncomfortable because one person or two people in our family at the dinner table are making us uncomfortable? No, they are the ones that need to feel that way. And so have conversations about this within your family. Definitely go protest, definitely go vote, definitely, read the legislation and look at things. One of the things that's important, we used to say things like, oh, an anti-racist lens, right? But for those of us who wear glasses, we take our lenses off and put them back on whenever we hope we can, when we go to sleep, etc. No, we need to have a racial justice and anti-racist mindset, because our mindset never goes away from us. So look at legislation, look at articles, look at everything through racial justice, with a racial justice mindset. So that way you know who to vote, you know what to vote for, etc. So I think those are kind of just from a real basic thing, but certainly if you're an employer, hire more people of color. If you're not an employer, start affinity groups when you're groups, so that people can feel affinity groups, meaning separating by something, right? So a lot of us, separate by people of color versus, or Black versus, indigenous versus Latino, etc., versus white. All of those things are happening. Have conversations in your workplace about anti-racism. It is not illegal. You're not going to get sued if you have conversations, not just about diversity, because I want to be clear, OAR believes in diversity, but we don't talk about diversity. We talk about anti-racism. So for many, many years, we have talked about diversity, and we're still where we are today. So we need to stop talking about diversity, and we need to talk about anti-racism. And I know there's folks out there who say, I am X, Y, and Z, and have experienced lots of pain and suffering and not privilege in where I am, and I understand that. And this is not the Olympics of who has more pain than others. But this is the reality, that people are in situations where every single system fails people of color. Not just one or two, every single system. So we all have to kind of do this together. So at OAR, we have about $80,000 in our given budget for direct services. So that means that, like, if someone needs housing, here's some money to the landlord, etc. If somebody needs clothing, here's some money to go buy clothing. If somebody needs food, here's this, right? So we are part of the safety net. So we talk almost on a weekly basis with our safety net people. So that's safety net nonprofits like Arlington Food Assistance Center, the Arlington Medical Center, I mean, all of them. So we're all together. We're all in this together. And so one of the huge pieces that came specifically during the COVID-19 crisis was the reality that we lost jobs. A lot of our people not only lost jobs, couldn't work, were in a place where they were unhealthy, got medical bills, etc. But so here we are with no jobs and somehow have to figure out how to pay all this stuff. So one of the things OAR did was like, you know what, we're going to have to figure out how to transfer this money to people in an easier way, in a faster way. Without people, we are big believers that you know yourself best, right? So you have the insight of your own self more than I could ever support you. And so instead of me having the know it way from a case management perspective, like we know better than you because I have a degree, means nothing. And so instead, you would probably make just as good as decisions as everybody else if you had more money, right? And so we really believe in this idea of cash and wealth transfer. So what we started doing, and last fiscal year is a great example, we were at our budget at $80,000 in the first 3 weeks of March because the COVID situation came. And so we could have just decided, all right, that's what we got. No, instead, we pushed through and we actually spent almost $145,000 in direct services. That's not enough. That's not enough. We could have done a lot more, but that's all we really could. We went into our reserves to be able to accomplish that. And so I think one of the pieces that's really important, and again, Luke, Google this idea of cash and wealth transfer, where people literally just get money and they make their own decisions. They don't have to go to money management class. They know. They don't have to, give you a little kind of sheet of what they're spending, the things they know. One of the reasons why we're not in crisis is because we might have some savings and we might have someone to fall back on, and most of these folks do not, because of generations of this system failing them. So housing moratorium, absolutely. Even though people are not getting evicted, the reality is that people are getting fees on those not paid months. So we had a person who was a participant. We don't call people clients, we call participants. Again, it's this idea of like people first and that they know their own kind of story. We had a person who was a participant who had not paid and had not called us, and so had racked up 2 months worth of unpaid rental assistance, or rent, sorry. And so what happens was now the landlord has also had fines. So in addition to the 2 months, he also has $600 worth of fines, late fees, fines, etc., that he has to pay. Well, if he already can't get the 2 months, I'm not really sure where the person thinks the $600 are going to come from. So this is, again, the idea of even though we have a moratorium, there's a ton of fines, and we're going to have to figure out as a community how to support people and pay for these. So that was another housing piece. So we really need help here. James Lown. Yes, absolutely. I've read that one too. There's also another thing about history, which I think would be really important to remember is, unfortunately, history is always told by the winners, right? By the victors. But there's hundreds of books on history from the perspective of the people who were here. Oh, good. So books written by people who were here, by the history of people who actually were the ones who were colonized. There's a lot of history books around there. So let's read some of those. I think for sure is another one. What do activities look like what do upstream activities look like in institutional education system? So we're just starting out. This is going to be a marathon. And so we're just starting out within kind of the system that we know about a lot more. But our hope is that upstream activities will be some of the things that kind of mentioned, which is the idea of let's change the books, right? Let's change the canon that we all believe we're reading in schools. Let's throw it out and let's see what's going on in our bookshelves in the schools. there's a study that says that images of people of color, that most of us people who are white don't ever see a lot of images of people of color, and so you might have a jolt when you actually see a person of color, not physically but maybe internally. And so one of the things they said is, if you show images of people of color, of historians, of authors, of really amazing people of color, all of a sudden you start, your body starts, in mind, start seeing people of color in a different way. So I think teachers, talk to your principals, etc. I mean, there's just a lot that you can do. And I think, you know, all of us, as a person who wanted to be a teacher, all of us really need to go back and relearn. So we need to unlearn, learn, and relearn actual everything. We need to relearn how to be in relationship with each other. We need to relearn how to be less competitive and how to be more collective. So, you know, this idea that, so in our communities, we're about collectiveness. If I'm not doing well, if I'm doing well, but those folks back right here are not doing well, we're all not doing well. I should not be doing so well if everybody around me is not doing well. And so this idea of individualism and capitalism that we live by in this country does not help the community. And I really think it's important. You know, this, just think about it. You might be like, okay, well, think about this, like, think about the COVID-19. Think about the mask situation. You're wearing masks to protect the people out there. You're not wearing masks to protect yourself. But we're willing to do that, and please wear your mask, right? But somehow we're not willing to do that for other things. So if I'm doing really well, but others are not, we're not doing well. It's all about collectiveness. And that's another canon that we have for OAR. I don't know. There certainly are out in the world. I think our youth is really kind of doing a lot in this space. So I can only imagine that there is. And I think one of the other things I heard yesterday, so Angie Thomas, she's the person who wrote The Hate U Give, right? And Kendi, and Dr. Kendi, Ibram Kendi, who wrote Anti-Racism. So last night they had a dialogue together. And one of the things they talked about, as well as James, I think Edwards, I have to go back and look at the writer, but the three of them talked about how kids want to have these conversations, but we're all nervous about the conversation, so we don't talk about them. When a kid's like, oh, look, a Black person, or look, that person's skin is different than mine, you're like, wait, don't do it, you know? No, like, this is exactly right. We're not colorblind here. We all see color. So of course our kids are trying to learn. So just because you, as a parent, as a teacher, as an adult, are afraid of having these conversations, does not actually mean we shouldn't be having them. It's the same as the sex conversation, the same as the pornographic conversation, the same as the drug conversation. We need to be having conversations about race with our kids from birth. That's the reality. There's even a book called Anti-Racist Baby. I mean, there's how to make an anti-racist baby, right? So like, literally, there's so much research out there. Let's make that happen. So yeah, so I think there's just a lot, and I do think that there's forums out there that kids are creating on youth are creating on social media that's supporting them. But we need to make this more of an option for them, and I don't actually know what's out there. Because we work mostly with adults, so we do have a youth component of our work, but mostly our work is with adults. We have kind of communities that support each other. So right now we have male of color that they do a support group for people who are coming home together, and then we have a women's group. You know, so it's kind of like that kind of component. I'm sure there's things out there, particularly in the social media sphere. Yes, and I think one of the pieces that Angie talked about last night was this idea that people were surprised by the talk that parents of color have to have with their children, the talk of how to be when a police officer pulls you over, what to say, what to do, what to not do, etc. And that surprises. Here's an interesting thing. I'm married to a police officer. And so I appreciate both the perspective that people in law enforcement and the courts have, as well as the rest of us. And I'm married to a police officer who absolutely believes in the same thing. And so we can do this. We're all in this together. We all want the same thing, right? We all want the same thing, especially people who are in the law enforcement. They don't want to have to be doing this. They don't want to have to be looked down in the way that they're looked down because of the historical context of policing. They want to be part of creating the collective community just like the rest of us. So we need to figure out, what to do about that. A couple of things. For those of you who live and work and all of that in Arlington, the Arlington Chief of Police, he is leaving this September or October. It's his last year. We just elected a very progressive, so we'll see how that goes. They're going to be asking community members to speak to the chief, the people that they're thinking about chief. So that's going to be interesting. But talk to your county board members and the county manager about what kind of chief you want. We just elected Parissa Degani Tafti as a Commonwealth attorney. She's a progressive Commonwealth attorney. OAR is very excited about the work that she's doing. That's why it's important to get out and vote and get the right people where they are. Ask questions of the sheriff, ask questions of the police department, ask questions, right? So for those of you who have a lot better relationship with law enforcement than the courts, I empower you to go out and ask questions, right? So this isn't about shame. This isn't about guilt. This is about, we need every single human being on this bus if we're going to figure out a way to make this better. We've had 400 plus years of this pain and harm, and that has to stop. That has to stop. I have a niece, she's 6, and I hope that by the time her children are born, we're going to be in a better place. And that's part of why OAR continues to do this work, because generations and generations have suffered, and it needs to stop. So we have 3 more minutes. I'm happy to see if there's any more questions that come. Okay, let's see. Oh, okay, so there's some really good stuff happening in the chat. So Leanne Russell from the Annie Casey Foundation is working with Arlington for this year, so and in December, to support us in figuring out more options for restorative justice. So OAR is in the group. They meet kind of every other week, and they've separated into 3, I believe. One is the school system, one is the community, and one is the criminal legal system. And so OAR's got 2 team members in the criminal legal system, and so we attend all of those meetings as well. We are all about it. I think what's going to have to happen at some point is that there needs to be some money put into creating restorative justice and alternative sentencing pieces. Otherwise, it's just going to be a report that sits somewhere. And everybody knows that. Leanne knows that, Parissa knows that, and we're trying to find ways to raise some money around that. Some of my aha moments can be eye-opening. I remember the first time I worked with a Black man in a fast food restaurant when I was in college. I watched him wash his hands in the sink and remember being a little surprised that the color did not wash off his hands. Then again, a conversation I overheard in a lingerie department in Macy's where a young Black woman was talking about this great bra her aunt had given her. She wore it until it wore out, but couldn't really afford to replace it. And the best part was it was Black and she could wear it under her white t-shirts. I remember thinking, then smacking my head that why would you ever wear a Black bra under a white t-shirt? It's these little moments that make me realize that I live in a different world and culture than the folks I work with. So true. So true. And I think one of the other pieces that's really important too is look at who's in leadership everywhere. Look at who's in leadership in the nonprofit world. Look at who's in leadership in your communities. Look at who's in leadership in your businesses, politicians, etc. We can't keep having people who are so far away from the communities that we connect with that they don't connect. We can't make decisions when we're so far away from the communities that are affected. So please just continue to look, continue to ask questions, continue to be involved. Shuffle your bookcase, shuffle your friendships with people, ruffle them up a little bit and have these conversations for us. It's not just for the people of color's benefit, it's also for you as white people to have more of wholeness in your lives. You all are also being harmed by racism because you don't get to have yourselves be whole, because you're missing out. So it's right at 11, and I know that's my time. You will get an email with links to all of the things we talked, well, to all of the OAR things we talked about. But please keep looking up and Googling things. It's really important. I'm here for a little bit longer, so I'm happy to stay, but I do want to yield the floor back so we follow whatever the next protocol. And I just want to thank you all for spending this time with me, and for being with us, and just keep up the fight. We need you. Stevenson's Just Mercy, and in the book it says, we are or more than just our worst mistake. And I think that that is critical. In addition to that, all of us are making mistakes. Just some of us get connected to the criminal legal system, and some of us don't.